first anatomical structure we will be discussing is the bones of humerus. Humerus consists of three bones, which is the humerus, the radius, and the ulna. Okay, let's talk about the first bone, which is the humerus. Humerus consists of the distal end humerus, which is the trochlea, with the capitulum. The next bone is ulna. The proximal end of ulna, which is the olecranon, will form the elbow joints, the pointy side of the elbow, and the trochlear notch of the ulna will articulate with the humerus. Okay, the last bone, which is radius, the radial head will articulate with the capitulum. The capitulum is a structure at the humerus. Because elbow is a joint, it will definitely have a type of structure that is called the cartilage. Cartilage is a connective tissue that plays a crucial role in protecting a joint and the bones. The ends of where the three bones are connected are covered with cartilage. Okay. The main function of cartilage is to allow the joint to slide easily against one another. This allows for the movement to happen. Cartilage also acts as a shock absorber. There are four types of ligaments in elbow joint. The first one being called radial collateral ligament. The second one, annular ligament. The third one, accessory collateral ligament. And the last one is lateral ulnar collateral ligament. The first ligament, which is the medial lateral collateral ligament. It is located inside of the elbow. And the second one, lateral ulnar collateral ligament, is located outside of the elbow. As you can see from the diagram, this is a lateral image of the elbow. You can see the location of the both ligament I've mentioned before. Okay, the function of these two ligaments. Both ligaments will provide for stability for the elbow, meaning it will hold the humerus and ulna tightly together. The other two ligaments, which is the annular ligament, functions as the holder of the radial head tightly to the ulna. And the last one, accessory lateral collateral ligament, it is located outside of the elbow. Okay, hi, it's me again, Faradila. Okay, let's talk about the nerves in the elbow joint. Okay, for elbow joint, there are three types of nerve, which is the radial nerve, the ulnar nerve, and the last one is the median nerve. Okay, this nerve runs all the way from the proximal of humerus to the distal of the radius and ulna. Okay, first I want to talk about the radial nerve. Okay, as you can see from the diagram I've provided, okay, the first one is the radial nerve. It is called radial nerve because it runs and located at the radius bone. And the function of radial nerve is to supply extensors, and this nerve is very vulnerable to injury. The second nerve is the ulnar nerve. Ulnar nerve, okay, this is the same as radial nerve. It is called ulnar nerve because it is located near the ulnar bone, and it will pass through the cubital tunnel, innervate some of my forearm muscle. This nerve is prone to compression, and the expression we use to call it is funny bone. Okay, the last nerve, which is the median nerve. From the name itself, we can tell it is called median nerve because it is located at the middle of the elbow joint. It is sandwiched between the humerus and radius and ulna. Okay, for median nerve, it runs anteriorly, innervates flexor muscle, and can be compressed into cubital tunnel syndrome. In elbow joint, we also have a structure called bursae. Bursae is a sac located at the lateral side of the elbow, at the pointy side of the elbow. It is a sac that contains a synovial fluid, and the exact location is it is located posterior to the olecranon. Okay, why do we have this bursae? Why we have this synovial sac filled of fluid? Okay, bursae functions as a friction reducer. Bursae is a structure that is very prone to inflammation. It is a site where the bursitis usually happen. In elbow joint, there are three types of artery. These arteries are called brachial artery, radial artery, and ulnar artery. Okay, for radial and ulnar artery, it is combined and called as collateral arteries. Okay, because elbow is a joint, it will have a structure called tendon. Okay, what is tendon? Tendon is a group of connective tissue where a group of connective tissue that connects your muscles to your bones. Okay, these tendons let you to have movement in your limbs. Okay, for elbow we have two tendons, which is the bicep tendons and the tricep tendons. Okay, for bicep tendons, it is located medially to the elbow. Okay, why we say it located medially? Because it attached to bicep muscles on the inside of the arm, on the inside of the elbow. And for tricep tendons, it attached to the tricep muscles at the back of the elbow, the back of the arm.
Hi, my name is Muhammad Iksan. I'm going to explain about joint articulation for elbow. The elbow joint is a complete hinge joint that connects the humerus, radius, and ulna. It looks like one joint. Actually, the elbow has three different joints working together. The three articulation will be the first one, humero-ulnar joint. The second one, humeroradial joint. The last one will be proximal radio-ulnar joint. I'm going to start the first main joint. It is called the humero-ulnar joint. It is between the humerus and ulna. This joint works like a hinge type, same like a door hinge. It lets you bend and straighten your arm. This movement is called flexion for bend the arm and extension for straighten the arm. The trochlea on the humeral fit into the trochlear notch on the ulna, like a puzzle pieces. This makes it strong and stable, so you can do things like a lift up or push up without hurting your arm. The humeral-ulnar joint is the main part that lets your elbow move back and forth or go up and down like a normal hinge. Next is the humeroradial joint. This one connects between humerus and radius bone. This joint is called a gliding joint. It doesn't move as much on its own, but it helps with other movement, especially when you turn your hand over like flipping your palm up or down. In this joint, the capitulum of the humor meets the head of the radius. It's a small joint than the first one, but still very important for daily use. When you rotate your forearm, like when turning a key or turning a page, this joint helps your radius move smoothly. The humeroradial joint doesn't do all the work, but it helps with bending and rotating, making your arm movement smooth and controlled. The last joint is the proximal radial ulnar joint. It connects the radius and the ulna near the elbow. This one is pivot joint, which means it lets your forearm rotate. That's how you can turn your palm up or palm down. This movement we call as supination and pronation. The head of the radius sits inside a ring. This ring is formed by a notch in the ulna called the radial notch and a strong band called the annular ligament. This setup lets the radius spin while staying tightly in place. So, the proximal radioulnar joint lets your forearm twist, which is really helpful when doing things like turning a knob or flipping a pancake. The next topic will be ligament connection. There are three ligaments that hold elbow bones. This ligament provides stability and control movement for elbow function properly. The first ligament will be the annular ligament. It forms a ring-like structure by attaching to both an anterior and posterior margin of the radial notch of the ulna. This ring completely encircles the head of the radius. It also prevents the radial head from dislocating laterally or inferiorly, especially in children. The second ligament will be ulnar collateral ligament. It is the primary stabilizer of the medial side of the elbow. It extends from the medial epicondyle of the humerus and attaches the coronoid process in the front and the elyconoid in the back. This band forms a triangular structure that provides medial stability and resists valgus stress. The last one will be radial collateral ligament. It is located on the lateral side of the elbow. It originates from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus and blends into the annular ligament. The main role is to anchor the lateral side of the joint and resist visceral stress. Now we'll talk about muscle tendon attachment around the elbow joint, focusing on where each major muscle originates. The first one is bicep brachii muscle. It inserts through a strong tendon onto the radial tuberosity. The second will be the brachialis muscle, inserts onto the coronoid process and the tuberosity of the ulna, deep to the biceps. The third will be branchioradialis muscle. It has more distal insertion, anchoring to the stellar process of the radius. On the posterior side, the tricep brachial tendon inserts onto the elyconoid process of the ulna. Next one will be calcaneus muscle. It's a small extensor that originates from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus and inserts on the lateral calcaneus and posterior ulna. Pronator teres muscle originates from the medial epicondyle of the humerus and inserts onto the lateral surface of the radius. Supinator muscle attaches from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus wraps around to the insert on the proximal radius. Common flexor tendon. It is originated from the medial epicondyle connecting to the flexor muscles. Last one is the common extensor tendon. It originates from the lateral epicondyle anchoring extensor muscles. The elbow joint capsule has two key anchoring points, a proximal attachment and distal attachment, allowing it to protect all the three articulations of the elbow. For proximally, the capsule attaches around the humeral fossae, including the radial fossa, coronal fossa, and coronal fossa. Distally, it anchors around the radial neck annular ligament and the proximal ulna, forming a tight seal around the moving part of the elbow. This proximal and distal attachment around the capsule to complete surround the humeral ulna, humeral radial, and proximal radial ulnar joints, initially connecting all the three bones, humerus, ulna, and radius. Joint capsule blends seamlessly with surrounding ligaments and tendons, to provide both mechanical support and flexibility during movement. Inside the capsule is a specialized synovial membrane which produces synovial fluid. Its role is reduce friction between the articulation process and nourish the arterial cartilage.
Okay, next let's talk about the biomechanical of the elbow joint. Elbow joint is called as trochogynclymod joint. Okay, this joint possesses 2 degrees of freedom, 2 degrees of movement that we call as flexion, extension, and the pronation and supination of the forearm. Okay, let's go deeper into this. Okay, the human's elbow can be flexed or extended from 0 degree. 0 degree is the full extension, up to 145 degree. This is the full flexion. Okay, where does this movement happens? This movement happens at the humeroulnar and humeroradial joints. Okay, for supination and pronations, it occurs at the proximal of radioulnar joint. Okay, the range of movement for pronation and supination. For pronation is about 80 degrees and for supination is about 85 degrees. An angle called valgus angle. The range of this angle is typically 10 degrees to 15 degrees in extension. And these valgus angles, it is aligned with the forearm. The valgus angles helps to align the forearm with the upper arm during a load-bearing task, meaning it will help the forearm to align with the upper arm when we are carrying a weight or lifting something. When a motion happens, the joint axis of rotation will shift slightly. Okay, why this happens? This happens because the shape of trochlea and capitulum is non-spherical, meaning it is not a round shape. It has irregular shape, so it will not stay intact with one another. So when a movement happens, it will shift slightly. Okay, in biomechanical of elbow, there is the flexion and extension. Okay, for flexion and extension, there is a certain angulation for them to be considered normal. Okay, for flexion, the normal angulation is 0 degree when in full extension and 145 degree when it is full flexion. Not all individuals have the same angulation of elbow during flexion and extension. Hyperlex individual may hyperextend by 10 degrees or more. Bodybuilders can only flex their elbow up to 130 degrees due to the muscle bulking on their arm. According to Morey, daily activities can be performed with angulation of elbow of 30 degree to 130 degree of flexion. However, a 3-dimensional study using electromagnetic tracking technology shows that a potential of varus valgus and axial laxity of about 3 to 4 degrees during elbow flexion. Next is the biomechanical of elbow during pronation and supination. Okay, the normal range of forearm supination is about 85 degrees and for pronation is about 80 degrees. Morey stated that most activity of daily living can be accomplished with 100 degrees of forearm rotation, meaning 50 degrees of pronation plus 50 degrees of supination. However, the angulation of pronation may be lost but can be compensated to some extent by abducting the shoulder. No effective mechanism to compensate for supination. If the longitudinal axis of forearm rotation, it goes from the radial head to the capitulum, proximally to the base of styloid process of the distal ulna distally. More studies shows that the axis of rotation will shift slightly during ulnar and volar supination and radial and dorsal during pronation. Up to 1 millimeter to 2 millimeter of radius shifting can be seen during pronation. Next is the biomechanical of elbow during pronation and supination. Okay, the normal range of forearm supination is about 85 degrees and for pronation is about 80 degrees. Mori stated that most activity of daily living can be accomplished with 100 degrees of forearm rotation, meaning 50 degrees of pronation plus 50 degrees of supination.
Hi, my name is Nurjana binti Abdul Aziz and I will explain about how the anatomical structure or part assigned are well suited to each other to perform their function. As my friends has stated before, the elbow consists of three joints, which is humero-radial joint, humero-ulnar joint, and radial ulnar joint. The four joints allow for movement, which is flexion, extension, supination, and pronation. Next, I will explain about humero-ulnar joint. Humero-ulnar joint is the connection between humerus bone and ulnar bone. As we identified before, at the distal humerus there is a trochlea, and at the proximal ulna there is a trochlear notch. Okay, bear in mind that the shape of trochlear notch of ulna is concave, while the trochlea at the distal humerus is convex. Concave means it is curved inwards, while the convex means it is curved outwards. So, the trochlear notch of ulna and the trochlea of humerus are perfect fits to each other. Yeah, just like this, the trochlear notch of ulna with concave shape and the trochlea of humerus as a convex shape, they perfect to each other to perform the elbow joint. Okay, next. During the flexion, coronal process of ulna will fit into coronal process of humerus. Okay, while at the extension, olecranon process of ulna will fit into olecranon fossa of humerus. So they are fixed to each other to perform a hinge joint. Next joint involved is humero-radial joint. Humero-radial joint is a connection between humerus bone and radius bone. During flexion, radial head of radius will fit into radial fossa of humerus, while during extension, radial head only articulate with the capitulum of the humerus. For the last joint that involved in elbow joint, which is proximal radio-ulnar joint. Proximal radio-ulnar joint. It is articulating between radial notch of ulna and the radial head of radius, which are responsible for supination and pronation of the forearm. In this part, I will explain about how they perform function. During movement, the bone, ligament, and muscle work as a team. During extension of the elbow, the bone involved is humero-ulnar joint and humero-radial joint. Humero-ulnar joint and humero-radial joint. It is extension, and the bone involved is humero-ulnar joint and humero-radial joint. While the ligament involved is MCL, specifically at the anterior band of the MCL, which is it will stress more than the other ligament. Okay. While the LCL and annular ligament only contribute for stability. The muscle involved in the extension is a tricep brachii will contract while the bicep brachii will relax. And the anconeus, which is a small muscle, will provide dynamic constraint to the varus. During flexion, the bone that involved is humero-ulnar joint and humero-radial joint. And during flexion, do remember that radial head of radius will be fit into the radial fossa of humerus, and coronal process of ulna will be fit into the coronal fossa of humerus. For ligament involvement, the ligament that involved is MCL especially on the posterior band, it will be more stressed than the other ligament, while the muscle that involved while the flexion is 3B. 3B is responsible for flexion. What is 3B? 3B is brachialis on the deeper side, while the bicep brachii on the superficial side, and the brachioradialis. You can see on the video shown below the the video about how the flexion and how the muscle contract during the elbow flexion. Next, during pronation, what will happen to our elbow? First, the bone involved is proximal radioulnar joint. Proximal radioulnar joint, and the muscle that get involved is pronator teres. This is supine position of forearm. When we pronate our palm, the pronator muscle, which is located around here, will contract with the help of brachioradialis as it is connected to the radius. For the ligament, the annular ligament is get involved and it is helped to stabilize the radial head, and the lateral collateral ligament will prevent excessive stress and rotation of the elbow. For supination, the bone that get involved in this position is proximal radioulnar joint, while the muscle that responsible for supinate the forearm is supinator muscle. Let's see, when the forearm is in the prone position, when we move to the supine position, the supinator muscle that located around here will get contract. If the forearm is in supine position, when we flex the forearm, the bicep brachii also get involved. For the ligament, lateral ulnar collateral ligament and annular ligament will stabilize the movement.
Assalamualaikum. Hi everyone. Today, we'll delve into a fascinating world of muscle contraction, understanding how our bodies generate movement. We'll start with an overview of skeletal muscle structure. Skeletal muscles are made up of individual muscle fibers, which are essentially muscle cells. Inside these muscle fibers, we find even smaller structure called myofibril. These myofibrils are crucial because they are composed of repeating units known as sarcomeres. Think of sarcomeres as the fundamental contractile unit of a muscle. Within each sarcomere, we have two primary contractile proteins, actin, which form the thin filament, and myosin, which forms the thick filament. These two proteins are the key players in muscle contraction. Let's talk about how a muscle receives its signal to contract, which happen at the neuromuscular junction. This is specialized site where a motor neuron, a nerve cell, communicate directly with a muscle fiber. When a signal arrives, the neurotransmitter acetylcholine is released. It then binds to specific receptor on the muscle fiber membrane, also known as the sarcolemma. This binding generates an electrical signal or an action potential within the muscle fiber. Now, let's follow that action potential and see how it leads to actual muscle contraction. This process is called excitation, contraction, coupling. Once generated, the action potential doesn't just stay on the surface. It travels along the sarcolemma and dive deep into the muscle fiber through invagination called T-tubule. This T-tubule acts like tunnel, ensuring the electrical signal reaches all parts of the muscle fiber. The arrival of the action potential in the T-tubule triggers a critical event, the release of calcium ions or Ca2+, from the sarcoplasmatic reticulum, which is a specialized endoplasmic reticulum designed to store Ca2+. Now, let's look at the troponin-tropomyosin complex. In a relaxed muscle, tropomyosin acts like a cover, blocking the myosin binding site on the actin filament, thereby preventing any contraction. However, when Ca2+ is released, it binds to troponin, causing a conformational change in the troponin molecule. This change can cause tropomyosin to shift away from the binding site, effectively exposing them. This unblocking is the crucial step that allows the muscle to prepare for contraction. With the binding site exposed, we move into the core mechanism of muscle contraction, the sliding filament theory, driven by a process called cross-bridge cycling. The myosin heads, which are already energized by the hydrolysis of ATP into ADP and inorganic phosphate pi, can now bind to the newly exposed active site on actin. This forms what we call a cross bridge. Once attached, the magic happens, the power stroke. The release of ADP and pi causes the myosin head to pivot, essentially pulling the actin filament toward the center of the sarcomere. This action shortens the sarcomere and generates the force we associate with muscle contraction. After the power stroke, a new ATP molecule binds to the myosin head, which is essentially for it to detach from the actin filament. Without new ATP, the muscle will remain in a rigid state, like in rigor mortis. Finally, this newly bound ATP is then hydrolyzed back into ADP and pi, re-energizing the myosin head and returning it to its cock position, ready for another cycle. This entire cycle, attachment, power stroke, detachment, and re-energizing, continue as long as calcium is present and ATP is available, leading to sustained muscle shortening and contraction. Just as important as contraction is the process of muscle relaxation. Once the signal to contract ends, the muscle needs to return to its resting state. The first step in relaxation involves the breakdown of acetylcholine in the neuromuscular junction by an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase. This effective terminates the nerve signal. Simultaneously, calcium ion Ca2+ are actively pumped back into sarcoplasmic reticulum. This reuptake requires energy as it carried out by Ca2+, ATP phase pump. As Ca2+ is removed from troponin, tropomyosin shifts back into its original position, covering the myosin binding site on the actin filaments. With this site recovered, myosin can no longer bind to actin. As a result, the muscle fibers relax and lengthen, either passively or due to action of opposing muscle. To make this all more concrete, let's look at how this principle applies to a common movement, elbow flexion, like it a bicep curl. When you decide to do a bicep curl, your brain sends signal to motor neuron of your bicep brachii muscle. This action potential reach the muscle fibers, triggering the release of Ca2+. This leads to the cross-bridge cycling we just discussed, where myosin heads bind to actin, pulling the sarcomeres shorter within your bicep. As the bicep shortens in a concentric contraction, it pulls on the radial tuberosity, causing your forearm to bend at the elbow. Meanwhile, your tricep, which is the antagonist muscle, relax or lengthen eccentrically to control the movement. Now, let's consider the opposite movement, elbow extension, like during push-up. For elbow extension, your brain sends signal to the motor neuron of your tricep brachii muscle. This action potential cause the tricep to contract. As the tricep shortens in a concentric contraction, it pulls on the olecranon process, resulting in the straightening of your elbow. In this case, your bicep, the antagonist, with relax or lengthen eccentrically to help control the movement. As you can see, these intricate cellular processes of muscle contraction and relaxation are constantly at play, allowing us to perform countless movements every day. Thank you for your attention.
Hi, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm Ummu Ifa Izzati binti Mataha. Let's continue with the diagram which presents the anterior view of the elbow. This perspective is as if we are looking directly at the front of the fully extended arm. We start from the humerus. At the superior aspect, we see the distal end of the humerus, the bone of the upper arm. Extending proximally from the articulating surfaces, we identify the lateral supracondylar ridge on the outer side and the medial supracondylar ridge on the inner side. Distally, we clearly see two prominent body projections, which is the lateral epicondyle on the outer aspect and the larger, more palpable medial epicondyle on the inner aspect. Between the epicondyles, there are two crucial articular surfaces, which is the capitulum, the rounded and located laterally, and then the second one is the trochlea, which is spool-shaped and located medially. Just superior to these articular surfaces, we observe two depressions, which is the radial fossa and the coronal fossa. These fossa allow for the accommodation of the radial head and coronal process when the elbow is full flexion. Next, we go to the forearm bones. Below the humerus, we see the two bones of the forearms, which is the radius is located at the lateral side, and the proximal end show the this shape head of radius, followed by the narrower neck of radius, and then the roughened radial tuberosity, which serve as an important attachment point for the bicep muscle. The second one is the ulna. It's located at the middle side, and the proximal end shows the ulnar tuberosity, another muscular attachment site, and the coronal process, which fits into the coronal fossa of the humerus. Now, let's rotate the elbow around the posterior view, which shows us the joint from the back. Start from the humerus. The distal humerus is at the top. The lateral supracondylar ridge and the lateral epicondyle are clearly visible on the outer aspect. Similarly, the medial supracondylar ridge and the medial epicondyle are also seen on the inner aspect. The most prominent feature on the posterior humerus is the large, deep olecranon fossa. This fossa is specifically designed to receive the olecranon process of the ulna when the elbow is fully extended, which allows for a straight arm. Next, the forearm bone, the ulna, is highly visible in this view, especially the most prominent upper part, the olecranon. This large hook-like process forms the bony tip of your elbow. You can also see the ulnar groove, a significant landmark located just posterior to the medial epicondyle. This groove is where the ulnar nerve passes, making the vulnerable to impact. The shaft of the radius extends distally. Its head of radius and its articular circumference are also visible. Next, we move the medial view of elbow joint, which offers a detailed look at the elbow from its inner side. Start from humerus. The distal humerus is at the top, with the medial supracondylar ridge and the prominent medial epicondyle being the dominant features on this aspect. The trochlea is clearly seen in its spool-like profile, articulating with the ulna. The capitulum is also visible, even if less prominent in this specific view. The capitulotrochlear groove, which is the articulation point between the capitulum and trochlea, is indicated. The ulna forms the primary articulation with the humerus from this view. The olecranon forms the posterior superior aspect of the ulna, and the coronal process projects anteriorly and inferiorly, defining the trochlear notch. From the radius side, the radius and its head of radius are seen anteriorly and inferiorly, demonstrating the relationship to the ulna and humerus from this angle. The radial tuberosity is also visible on the radius. Finally, we proceed to the lateral view, which shows the elbow from its outer side. From humerus, the distal humerus is at the top, featuring the lateral supracondylar ridge and the distinct lateral epicondyle. The capitulum, the rounded articular surface of the humerus, is clearly seen articulating with the radius. The olecranon of the ulna forms the prominent posterior point of the elbow in this view. The head of radius is distinctly visible, articulating with the capitulum. This view particularly highlights the three key functional joints within the elbow: the humeral radial joint, the articulation between the capitulum of the humerus and the head of the radius, the humeral-ulnar joint, which is the main hinge joint between the trochlea and the ulnar olecranon. Crucially, the proximal radio-ulnar joint is also clearly visible, where the head of the radius articulates with the ulna. This joint is fundamental for forearm rotation. Now, let's start by understanding the anatomy visible of an epi or anteroposterior projection of the elbow. On this epi view, we are looking straight through the elbow from front to back. This perspective minimizes superimposition and allows for good visualization of the medial and lateral structures. At the bottom of the humerus, we clearly see the medial epicondyle and lateral epicondyle. In a well-positioned epi view, this should appear relatively equidistant from the extraphyllum, indicating no significant rotation of the humerus. The trochlea is visible medially, and the rounded capitulum is visible laterally. Above the trochlea and capitulum, you might finally discern the coronal fossa and radial fossa, appearing as slightly darker areas. At the ulna, the proximal end of the ulna is seen articulating with the trochlea. The coronal process and olecranon process are largely superimposed over the trochlea in this direct epi view, but their general outline contributes to the joint space. The ulnar tuberosity is an attachment point of muscles, can be faintly visible on the anterior aspect of the ulna. The head of radius is clearly visible as a disc-shaped structure articulating with the capitulum. In a true epi, it will show a slight overlap with the capitulum and the ulna. The narrower neck of radius is seen just below the head. The radial tuberosity, another important muscle attachment site, is usually seen partially superimposed on the ulna or in slight profile depending on the subtle rotation. The joint spaces, the humeral ulnar joint space and the humeral radial joint space are both visible and appear open in a well-positioned epi view. This allows for assessment of any narrowing or widening indicative of disease or injury. Next, let's shift our focus to the lateral projection. This is an important side profile of the elbow joint. This view often involves more superimposition of bony structures but reveals vital alignment and soft tissue sign. With the distal end of the humerus is at the top, and in a perfectly true lateral view, the medial and lateral epicondyles should be perfectly superimposed, appearing as one distinct outline. This superimposition is a key indicator of correct positioning. The olecranon fossa is a large depression of the posterior humerus is clearly visible posteriorly. The outline of the trochlea and capitulum are also discernible, though superimposed, defining the articular surface of the distal humerus. The olecranon process is highly prominent in this view, forming the distinct large bony tip of the elbow at the posterior aspect. The coronoid process is visible anteriorly, just inferior to the trochlear notch. The large trochlear notch of the ulna forms the deep C-shaped articulation with the humerus. The head of radius appears as a distinct circle or oval, articulating with the capitulum. It will be seen slightly overlapping the ulna. The radial tuberosity is usually well visualized, sometimes in profile, depending on the exact degree of forearm rotation. The humeral ulnar joint space and the humeral radial joint space are seen in profile, allowing assessment of their integrity. The proximal radial ulnar joint are also clearly visible and important for evaluate forearm rotation. There are three critical anatomy lines and soft tissue signs in this unique lateral view. First is the fat pad sign. This is one of the most important features. In a normal elbow radiograph, you should only see a small triangular lucency, or known as the dark area at the radiograph anterior to the distal humerus, which is the anterior fat pad. The posterior fat pad is normally hidden. If either fat pad is elevated or displaced, particularly if the posterior fat pad becomes visible, it strongly suggests a joint effusion and often indicates an hidden fracture, even if the fracture line itself is not directly visible. Next is the anterior humeral line, and it is an imaginary line along the anterior cortex of the humerus, and it should pass through the middle third of the capitulum. The deviations can indicate a supracondylar fracture. The last one is the radiocapitular line. It's also an imaginary line through the center of the radial head and the neck. It should always pass through the capitulum, regardless of the degree of the elbow flexion. If this line does not pass through the capitulum, it indicates a dislocation or stabilization of the radial head. In summary, the epi and lateral projection are complementary. The epi view offers a clear frontal look, especially at the epicondyles and overall joint space. The lateral view, despite more bony overlap, is indispensable for evaluating key alignment lines, the critically important fat pads, and specific parts like olecranon and radial head in profile. These two views provide a comprehensive anatomical assessment for accurate diagnosis of elbow pathology.